The vibration of heavy Earth base causes the bulkheads of the ring to shudder and accidentally triggers a deeply hidden ancient weapon. Because of a single everyday musical habit, Lyra finds herself trapped in a flooding airlock, along with an alien fugitive paralyzed by terror. Outside, the station management prepares a lethal chemical purge of the sector, allowing exactly 10 minutes for a manual system shutdown. When the steel main valves are torn away by pressure and hot water rises to the knees, the human will have to turn this irritating acoustic chaos into the only working tool for survival. Lyra smoothed out the thick paper with her palm, upon which the sectors of the ring were drawn in ink. The aliens considered this route map an archaic luxury, but the old paper smelled pleasant and did not go dark during power surges. Lyra broke off a piece of baked earth ham, and a thick aroma of garlic and smoked meat drifted through the sanitary block. The translucents stationed by the sterilizers turned their heads in unison, their pale nasal membranes resembling gelatinous plastic, constricted with disgust. They could not stand the organic smells of human food, nor Lyra's habit of wasting precious break minutes on a hot lunch instead of scheduled disinfection. Lyra paid them no mind. She reached for the old player connected to the general maintenance frequency and pressed the play button. An old Earth track erupted from the speakers. A heavy, dirty bassline with a sharp, broken rhythm hit the ears. The translucents winced. One of them even raised a thin finger, intending to make a remark, but the phrase got stuck in his colorless throat. The low frequency of the human song sent waves through the bulkheads of the laundry, and at that moment, a dull metallic click echoed deep within. An ancient plate behind the drying drums, which the station engineers had considered a dead piece of hull plating for 100 cycles, suddenly dropped by half a centimeter. Hidden beneath it, a beacon left by the former masters of these sectors caught the physical vibration of the base. On its matte surface, crimson dots began to light up one by one, pulsing strictly in time with the broken earth rhythm. The indicators on the medical panel exploded in crimson. The instruments recorded a wild spike of energy coming from the laundry. "Attention!" the speaker overhead shrieked on a high note, breaking into ultrasound. "Activation of an unknown weapon detected in the sanitary sector. All posts, a targeted sabotage has been recorded. Prepare for a hard purge of the zone." One of the medical coordinators, whose skin turned absolutely gray from fear, rushed to the exit, hitting the emergency evacuation button as he ran. The second one tried to grab Lyra by the sleeve of her jumpsuit, pointing toward the corridor, but she calmly pushed his hand away. The professional wrecker had no intention of leaving her lunch and rightful rest just because the alien sensors had gone crazy from good music. Amidst the rising wail of sirens and the clatter of automatic shutters, Lyra saw Dra'Ken. The fugitive was huddled in a ball between the heavy tanks for disinfecting solution. His translucent body feverishly changed shades from blue to a muddy yellow, while his fingers gripped the ventilation grate convulsively. He was paralyzed by terror, unable to take a single step toward the closing doors. In a second, the automation would have simply crushed him, or left him under the translucent's purging beams. Lyra cursed, scooped up her paper map, and stepping forward, grabbed Dra'Ken's slimy shoulder with a death grip. She yanked him toward her, dragging him to the narrow emergency compartment of the laundry. The alien weighed surprisingly much. His feet slid across the tiles, but Lyra stubbornly hauled him along. Pressing her shoulder against the heavy airtight door of the airlock, she shoved the fugitive inside and forcefully pulled down the manual locking lever. Steel pins slammed into their slots with a resounding crash. Outside, the panic of the translucents and orders to purge the sector remained, while inside, a stifling, dim silence took hold, broken only by the muffled thumping of bass through the wall. The beacon outside continued to pump energy, synchronizing with Lyra's player. The confined space had a catastrophic effect on Dra'Ken. Instead of calming down, he began to bolt across the cramped patch of floor, knocking into distribution panels with his back. His long upper limbs jerked chaotically, snagging on the conduits protruding from the walls. Lyra tried to shout for him to freeze, but she was too late. With a sharp metallic crunch, Dra'Ken slammed his weight against the main sanitary mixture supply pipe. The copper mounting could not withstand his weight and was torn out of the bulkhead with a chunk of metal. From the resulting gap, A fountain of icy technical water, mixed with acrid disinfectant, erupted under ferocious pressure. The sealed compartment instantly began to fill with steam, and within seconds the water rose to their ankles. Lyra tossed her soaked rations onto the top shelf and lunged toward the emergency hub. Water lashed directly into her face, flooding her eyes and making it hard to breathe. The skin on her hands began to sting from the chemicals. "Stay there, and don't move," she barked at the alien, though he likely did not understand the Earth tongue. She fumbled at her belt for a heavy adjustable wrench. The tool slipped from her wet fingers, falling into the swirling water, and Lyra had to dive in up to her elbow to find it. Catching the metal handle, she braced her boots against the slippery wall and hooked the jaw of the wrench onto the sheared-off nut of the main line. The lashing pressure tried to kick the tool out of her hands. Lyra threw her entire weight against it, feeling her back muscles go numb from the strain. The nut yielded by a quarter turn, then another quarter. The water continued to hiss and foam, but the jet began to weaken, turning into a thick drip. Lyra made one last convulsive heave, tightening the thread as far as it would go. The flow stopped. The professional wrecker slumped heavily against the wet bulkhead, trying to catch her breath. Her jumpsuit was soaked through, water dripped from her hair, and a scratch wrench was clenched in her hand. The leak was temporarily plugged, but the water level in the compartment already reached the middle of her shins. Dra'Ken had huddled into the furthest corner. His breathing was ragged and wheezing, and his skin cast a dull purple hue. He stared at the human with massive eyes full of incomprehension. At that moment, the first heavy blow struck the locked airtight door from the outside. It was the translucence. Through the thick metal, their voices sounded muffled but distinct. "Open the compartment. Earthborn, hand over the saboteur and shut down the starter device, or we will burn out the block with you inside." The station shuddered again. The ancient beacon behind the wall, driven by the relentless rhythm of the human song, emitted a new, even more powerful wave of vibration that made the surviving pipes ring. The icy, foul-smelling liquid had already completely submerged the fallen rations, turning the piece of earth ham into a slimy gray mess. Lyra stood elbow-deep in the water, breathing heavily through her mouth so the acrid disinfectant concentrate would burn her nasopharynx less. The metallic scraping against the airtight door outside ceased, but a moment later, the thick layer of steel responded with a fine, bone-jarring tremor. That was the sound of industrial cutters from the lower tiers at work. Lyra stepped toward the viewing port, kicking up splashes. The outer lens was partially smeared with foam, but through the murky streaks, she saw that the pale translucence had retreated into the background. The open space before the airlock was occupied by 3 men in heavy oil-stained jumpsuits, scrappers from the lower decks of the ring. Clutched in the hands of the one in front was a bulky plasma torch connected to a shoulder-mounted battery, a model known as the Cutter 4. The junk buyers from the human sector had dragged industrial equipment here, clearly intending to take the fugitive for the promised reward, and, while they were at it, strip the valuable wiring from the laundry, chalking everything up to the consequences of an alien act of sabotage. To them, an alien life was merely expensive cargo that needed to be pried out of a metal box. Behind the bulkhead, there was a dull, powerful thud. The ancient beacon, catching the rhythm from the speaker, sharply increased its heat output. The ceiling of the emergency sector hissed, driving droplets of condensation downward. The small internal scanner above Lyra's head began to blink with rapid orange flashes, warning of critical overheating of the perimeter. Another 30 seconds of such heat, and the station's automation would trigger an emergency discharge of concentrated coolant directly into the airlock to prevent a fire. For the translucent fugitive, this gas was a lethal poison. Dra'Ken himself had completely lost control from the mounting roar of the torch behind the wall. His body shifted colors feverishly, flushing with a toxic, pulsating purple hue. The alien scrambled across the flooded patch of floor, slammed his back hard against the distribution board, and tore off the fragile plastic casing of the wiring. A dry crackle rang out, and white sparks from a short circuit flew into the water from the exposed wires, while the temperature sensor on the wall wailed on a single high note from the flash. The external scanner above the door now clearly transmitted their precise coordinates to the junk buyers via a thermal silhouette. Lyra cursed, thrust her hand under her wet jacket, and pulled out a thick paper map. The old yellowed cellulose with ink route markings was the only truly precious thing she kept. The map smelled pleasantly of dry earth and real wood, a luxury that could not be bought on the ring for any amount of savings. Without hesitation, Lyra tore the thick sheet in half and then ripped it into several more pieces. She threw the scraps of paper into the dirty chemical water beneath her feet, waited a second for the cellulose to turn into a heavy, sticky mush, and lunged toward the ventilation grill of the internal sensor. Lyra began to forcefully smear the wet paper pulp over the scanner glass and the air duct slits, driving the fibers into every groove with her fingers. The dense, moist layer instantly blocked the lens, isolating the internal heat from the external instruments. The navigator that linked her to home had turned into a dirty gray plug. On the tactical screen of the junk buyers outside, the entire laundry sector cooled down at once, turning into a dead, empty void. What the hell? It cut out. The distorted metallic shout of a scrapper came from behind the door. The sensor is dead. They've blocked the signal. They're masking the bastards. Furious cursing erupted outside. Having lost the fugitive's exact thermal trail, the junk buyers and the translucents finally lost their patience. Instead of carefully cutting out the locking pins, they cranked the industrial plasma to maximum power, deciding to simply burn through the entire airlock plating, along with whoever was inside. A terrifying mounting roar echoed in the silence of the compartment. The upper part of the airtight door began to rapidly glow crimson. The metal bubbled, and hot ripples ran across the water. Lyra turned to Dra'Ken. The alien was barely breathing now, his purple skin fading and becoming covered in gray spots from the toxic steam. He gasped for air convulsively, preparing to throw himself once more at the damaged life support pipes that were barely holding on by a thread. The compartment's airtight seal was rapidly failing, and the steel pins of the lock had already begun to soften under the pressure of the directed plasma. Lyra lunged through the water, threw her full weight against the alien, and forcefully clamped her palm over his slimy mouth, pinning his head to the wet wall. Quiet now, breathe steady. She exhaled directly into his ear membrane, though she knew he wouldn't understand a word. With her free hand, Lyra reached for the wall panel of the emergency comms, tore off the protective cap, and pressed the general internal link key, intending to speak to those holding the cutters. The emergency comm speaker spat a dry, piercing crackle into the sweltering gloom of the compartment before Lyra could even draw a breath of the humid air. The screen on the wall above her head flashed a short line. The automated fire suppression system had detected critical heating on the outer perimeter of the airlock. Less than 2 minutes remained until the remote release of concentrated coolant, a chemical mist that was guaranteed to sear the respiratory tracts of the alien huddled in the corner. "This is Lyra, Doc Girl, personal identification number 0243. Her voice, amplified by the old membrane of the intercom, sounded unexpectedly flat and heavy, cutting through the furious scream of the plasma cutter behind the melting door. "Listen to me carefully, wreckers. Shut down your torches if you don't want this sector blown apart along with your tubs on the lower deck." The rumble behind the wall did not cease immediately. The metal managed to emit a long, cooling groan before the hissing of the plasma stopped completely. The mercenaries from the lower decks knew how to calculate losses. The destruction of a station block due to the detonation of an ancient circuit would instantly nullify any reward for capturing the fugitive Dra'Ken, turning them into targets for the ring's security services. "What are you babbling about, Doc Girl?" The raspy voice of the senior scrapper, distorted by interference, came through the speaker. "Open the shutter before we cut your lock to hell. Your alien is just someone else's money. Don't meddle in someone else's business." "This is my business," Lyra snapped, adjusting her grip on the wet wrench. "All this panic in the laundry isn't some accidental glitch. I activated this sector on purpose. This is a planned sabotage by the Earth Syndicate, and this beacon is now responding to my frequencies. Take one more step toward the door, and I'll crank the resonance to full power. Everyone dies." The Translucent's medical staff, on duty at the control consoles in the corridor, accepted this lie without a single doubt. For their sterile, regulated minds, the crude Earth music, the refusal to undergo disinfection, and the constant violation of sanitary protocols by the human Lyra now instantly fell into a clear, logical pattern of a terrorist threat. Sabotage countermeasure instructions demanded the immediate isolation of the flashpoint rather than a blind assault. Earthborn, the thin, vibrating voice of the medical coordinator, cut into the conversation. Your actions have been recorded by the central processor. The station gives you exactly 10 minutes for the manual deactivation of the triggering device. After 600 seconds, we will lock down the entire sanitary block and begin a cross-sector coolant purge from the upper tiers. The clock started. Lyra did not answer. She knew that the wreckers were already checking her personal data through the ring's general network, trying to figure out who they were dealing with. Half a minute later, the speaker came to life again, but now the mercenary's voice sounded different. It held a tone of mean, confident triumph. "The girl isn't lying," the scrapper spat, reading lines from a portable terminal. 7 years ago, 3rd Sector docks. Lyra, supply shift lead, official reprimand and demotion to entry-level positions for creating an emergency situation in the repair zone. Because of her negligence back then, 3 hydraulic seals blew out, and half the dock sat without power for a week. She knows where to hit, boys. She's a professional wrecker. Even now, she's using that slimy freak as cover to write off her sins. Lyra grit her teeth, feeling the boiling water begin to rumble hollowly inside the life support hoses. The station protocols had officially recorded her status as guilty, cutting off any possibility of justifying herself later. The past failure in the docks, which she had spent so many years trying to forget while working as a common loader for pennies, had now become her primary weapon and her death warrant all at once. The market held its breath, and the entire deck now viewed humans as a threat to the survival of the ring. They had given her 10 minutes of legal pause, and she could not afford to waste them on arguments. The water around her shins had already become scaldingly warm from the heating walls. Lyra turned toward the main pipe distribution hub, which protruded from the wall directly above the broken panel. The heavy wrench settled with difficulty onto the rusted edge of the main bypass valve. She needed to manually reroute the sanitary mixture flows around the central collector to lower the steam pressure and trick the automation, preventing the coolant from flowing through the pipes into the airlock ahead of schedule. The metal resisted, emitting a dry, piercing crack with every movement of her arm. Lyra pressed her wet boot against the bulkhead, feeling her shoulder muscles begin to go numb from the strain. The nut gave way by a quarter turn, releasing a thin, hissing jet of white steam. Dra'Ken, who had been sitting motionless in the corner until then, completely lost the last of his composure at that sharp sound. The alien did not understand the essence of human negotiations over the comms, but the whistle of steam and the clicks of switching relays seemed to him like the start of an inevitable purge. He lunged forward convulsively, trying to find safety in the narrow space between the pipes. His long, boneless upper limb crashed with blind force directly onto the bypass valve that Lyra had just secured with a cable tie. There was a short, terrible crunch. The fragile copper threading of the old regulator could not withstand the weight of the alien's massive body and snapped off at the very base. A pillar of hot steam roared out of the shattered socket, instantly filling the upper part of the compartment with a dense, suffocating cloud. The time for manual repairs was cut in half. Now the temperature sensors on the outside of the airlock would record the critical point in just 3 minutes instead of the promised 10. "Back!" Lyra barked, shoving the alien deeper into the compartment with her elbow. She tried to hook the jaw of the wrench onto the remains of the sheared pin, but the tool simply slid off the smooth metal slick with chemicals. Restoring the automatic circulation manually in this dead end was now impossible. The entire life support system of the laundry was tied to the central console of the translucents, and any attempt to fix one node led to an overload of adjacent lines. Lyra lowered her hand with the wrench into the dirty water. The only way out was to stop playing by the rules of the station. She didn't need to fix the breakdown. She needed to completely isolate this sector from the central network, taking the physical confrontation to a new engineering level. To do this, she had to break open the junction box of the adjacent technical field, located behind a solid bulkhead where the sensors of the translucents could not reach. Lyra leaned with all her weight against the valve fragment, jamming the handle of the wrench into it as a plug and locking it tight with the remnants of the wire. The lashing pressure of the steam subsided, turning into a poisonous, intermittent hiss. On the tactical screen of the scrappers outside, the laundry compartment finally went still, recording the autonomous status of a sabotage zone. The broadcast of her guilt ended with the dry click of the communication being cut off. The translucents and the mercenaries outside ceased their assault, retreating to the main control console to wait while the declared saboteur either met her terms or choked on the coolant. Lyra leaned heavily against the vibrating wall, looking at the frozen alien. They had gained their 10 minutes of autonomy within a collapsing system, but now the entire station was hunting them. The hot, rusty water was rising too fast, forcing her to shift from foot to foot to protect her boots from the corrosive disinfecting chemicals. The wires overhead hissed from the dampness, and the automatic timer of the ring, displayed on a small wall screen, ruthlessly counted down the seconds until the purge began. Lyra felt for the massive steel buckle of her work jumpsuit with her fingers, ripped it from the belt with force, and used the sharp edge as an improvised lever. Metal ground against plastic until she managed to tear out the fasteners of the protective casing on the junction box of the adjacent technical field. Right under the cover, she discovered the deck's old backup communicator, designed for emergency contact between repair crews and the central processor. At that moment, the speakers above the airlock door exploded with a heavy, rolling rumble. The scrappers, realizing the plasma torch was useless against the locked bolts of the airlock, turned to psychological pressure and began broadcasting the dock girl's personal file on the general frequency of the sanitary sector. The dry mechanical voice of the ring's onboard computer carried her biographical details through the corridors and residential tiers, transforming ordinary workplace negligence into a premeditated threat. The mercenaries intentionally portrayed the human race as a source of constant chaos, reminding all inhabitants of the station about the accident 7 years ago in the third sector of the docks. They accused Lyra of systemic sabotage, digging up old reports from the archives and making humans on the market the scapegoats for that technological catastrophe. Dra'Ken completely lost what remained of his control from this sudden roar of alien voices. His long body darted convulsively across the flooded patch of floor, and in blind terror, the alien leaned his back directly against the exposed guts of the opened panel, tearing out an entire bundle of power cables with his shoulder. A blinding bluish flash lit up the room, and white sparks from a short circuit showered into the water with a dry crackle. Dra'Ken's tissues began to pale rapidly, turning a deathly white shade from the powerful electric shock. Lyra reacted instantly. She stepped forward and, using her shoulder and head as a battering ram, shoved the massive alien away from the exposed wiring unit with her whole body. A severe electrical burn slashed across her right forearm, making her grit her teeth against the sharp pain, while the wall timer went haywire from the flash, instantly cutting the time remaining until the release of the lethal coolant to 90 seconds. Lyra breathed heavily, pressing her damaged arm to her chest, but she did not even glance at the sparking cable. Instead of trying to cut the broadcast wire or silence the mercenaries' transmission, she stubbornly reached for the charred contacts of the backup communicator. Her fingers found the copper strands in the dirty water, and she manually, directly bridged the damaged line to the central frequency of the entire market and the residential docks of the ring. She went on the air herself, seizing control of the signal from the mercenaries. Lyra had no intention of making excuses, asking for help, or engaging in pointless arguments with those standing behind the door. She brought her face close to the cracked microphone membrane and spoke in a steady, heavy voice. 7 years ago, in the docks of the third sector, I did indeed rip out 3 hydraulic locks, Lyra stated, and her words echoed across all decks of the station. I did it with my bare hands because the management of the ring ordered the isolation of the emergency block, with repairmen trapped inside just to save energy. They wanted to weld the airlocks shut and write the people off as industrial losses. But I chose to save the living. I broke the system then, and if I have to, I will do it again, right now. A dead, stunned silence fell over the speakers of the ring. The traders and the scrappers outside the airlock faltered, realizing that their main blackmail lever had been completely destroyed. The compromising information they intended to sell at a high price had been voiced by the Earthborn dock girl herself, turning a shameful dismissal into an act of conscious choice. The entire space market now understood that inside the locked laundry was not a negligent port worker, but a human ready to destroy any equipment for the survival of those who happened to be inside. The external social pressure burst, replaced by the tense, frightening anticipation of thousands of alien eyes watching the instrument readings. Dra'Ken, who had been frantically thrashing against the wall until then, froze. He saw the human's burned shoulder and felt the change in her intonations, in which there was no longer any room for fear or aggression, and his chaotic purple color began to slowly stabilize. The alien skin took on a deep, even, and pure hue, signaling extreme concentration. Understanding the human's act without any translation, the fugitive made a reciprocal move of trust. His translucent chest membranes slid aside with a quiet rustle, exposing the internal structure of his body, and in the very center of his jelly-like tissues, a glowing, incredibly fragile biological structure was revealed. It was a dormant spore of his kind, pulsing with a soft amber light. This living node removed all questions about the reasons for his escape from the translucence. Dra'Ken was not a criminal or a political saboteur. He carried within him the future of his entire race, a precious seed, which would have been guaranteed to perish upon the first contact with the station's sterilizing coolant. Humans and aliens on the ring had argued about regulations for years, but now Lyra faced a vulnerable life that the automation of the laundry was about to incinerate in a few dozen seconds. The broadcast of the dossier from the scrappers finally choked and cut off, leaving the broadcasting frequency empty. Lyra stood knee-deep in hot water in front of the sparking box of the technical field, cradling her burned arm, and stared fixedly at the defenseless, pulsing spore inside her companion. The iron pipes around them began to emit a metallic hum, foretelling an imminent explosion, and only moments remained until the chemical purging of the compartment. The hot, rusty water accumulated on the floor of the laundry squelched unpleasantly with every step, pouring into her boots and making Lyra shift from foot to foot. A little more than 80 seconds remained before the discharge of concentrated coolant, and the automatic timer on the wall continued its ruthless countdown, blinking with a dim orange light through the veil of acrid steam. The amber glow of the spore in Dra'Ken's chest reflected in the oil slicks on the water, reminding them that they had no time for panic or long reflections. Lyra shifted her gaze from the vulnerable alien nest to the humming main pipes, which vibrated so violently as if a frantic mechanical heart were beating inside them. It was necessary to act immediately, and the only obvious solution remained to completely isolate the emergency section by cutting off the power supply to the Madden beacon. Lyra gripped the heavy adjustable wrench with her left hand, as her right forearm had gone numb after the recent electric shock, covered in dark burn blisters and refusing to obey. She took a deep breath, trying to ignore the pulsing pain, and stepped toward the main pipe valve, which protruded from the bulkhead like a rusty metal wheel. The tool fitted onto the deformed edge of the regulator with difficulty and a slimy screech. Lyra pressed her wet boot soles into the base of the wall and leaned on the handle with all her weight, trying to move the century-old bolt from its dead point. The metal of the pipes responded with a long, vibrating groan that made the entire structure of the laundry shudder. Because of her damaged right arm, the force was distributed unevenly. The wrench kept slipping, stripping the remaining paint from the fastener. Dra'Ken, instinctively protecting his open chest membranes and the pulsing amber grain from the rising heat, slowly backed away into the deepest, flooded part of the technical field, where the water already reached his knees. The ancient beacon behind the wall seemed to feel the attempt to block its supply channels. The crimson dots on its matte panel flared up with triple intensity, and the vibration frequency of the walls reached such a peak that Lyra's ears popped and an involuntary dry cough escaped her throat. The pressure inside the system spiked to a critical level, and the steam around the pipes began to wail, turning into a continuous, piercing whistle. At that moment, a short, deafening pop rang out. The old copper threading of the main valve could not withstand the counterpressure and snapped, shattering into tiny fragments. The heavy wrench was violently torn from Lyra's hands. It spun through the air, slashed painfully across her shoulder, and vanished into the bottom of the flooded compartment with a heavy splash. Hissing fountains of boiling water erupted in all directions from the shattered joint. The path of classic physical repair, insulation, and brute force system shutdown was final and irrevocably closed by the breakdown. The standard engineering protocols of the ring no longer held any power here, and the tools had turned into useless junk. Lyra froze, breathing heavily and staring at the empty pipe fragment from which gray, suffocating smoke was pouring. For a second, an oppressive silence reigned in the gloom, broken only by the gurgling of the rising water and the soft whistling of cooling metal. The plan had failed. She admitted it immediately without anger or despair, simply recording the fact as she had done thousands of times during grueling shifts at the port. Fighting the mechanics of the station with force was pointless. The ring always proved to be stronger, heavier, and more indifferent to those who tried to turn its bolts against the instructions. Lyra turned her back on the destroyed distribution panel and trudged away from the broken equipment. Every movement was a struggle. Her wet jumpsuit weighed a good 10 kilograms, and her burned forearms stung from contact with the damp steam. Lyra descended the slippery steps of the platform after Dra'Ken, submerging herself into the warm, dirty water of the technical field. The focus of her attention shifted from the dull, jammed iron to the environment itself, to this sewage slush that now filled the entire space around them. The water continued to rise, and within it, as if in a massive resonator, every beat of the ancient device echoed with doubled intensity. The beacon pulsed, preparing its final energy discharge, and this tremor was transmitted to Lyra's body through the soles of her boots, making every bone vibrate. She stepped almost right up to the frozen alien, feeling a wave of damp heat emanating from his translucent skin. Dra'Ken did not move. His purple tissues remained dark and retracted, while the amber light of the spore inside his chest contracted convulsively with every new jolt of the machinery. Lyra shot a quick glance at the wall display. 45 seconds remained until the chemical purge. The time for standard solutions had run out. They had no spare valves left, no working tools, and no communication with the outside world. This entire massive technological machine of the trading ring was now preparing to destroy them simply because it did not know how to handle chaos any other way. Then, through the total scorching of the sector, she slowly lowered her left hand into her jumpsuit pocket, feeling for the small, angular box of her old Earth player, which had miraculously remained unharmed during the flood. Lyra pulled it out, looking at the scratched plastic casing. Her habit of taking time for a proper lunch, listening to old music, and ignoring the sterile rules of foreign bosses had always been considered a weakness on the station, the stupidity of a dock girl incapable of fitting into the perfect schedule. But right now, this mundane earthly detail remained the only object in the compartment that was not part of the broken system of the ring. Lyra leaned her back against the vibrating iron bulkhead, feeling her fingers brush against the bottom drainage pipes beneath the water. The metallic groan around them became unbearable, foreshadowing an imminent explosion, and the coolant in the upper mains had already begun its movement with a characteristic dry rustle. Lyra adjusted her grip on the player, clamped the headphone wire between her teeth, and looked Dra'Ken straight into his massive frozen eyes, preparing to trigger the one thing that had originally stirred this sector to life. Lyra clenched the thin headphone wire with her teeth and jerked her head sharply to the side. The cheap plastic insulation gave way with a dry snap, leaving an unpleasant chemical aftertaste of machine oil and burnt rubber on her lips. Spitting the fragments of the casing into the rusty water, she caught the bare copper strands with her left hand. Less than 40 seconds remained until the lethal coolant discharge. She took a heavy step toward the shattered backup commutator panel, which was sparking incessantly above the water's surface, and without hesitation, she jammed the bare wires of the player directly into the damp contacts of the station network. The fragile Earth device short-circuited directly into the temperature sensors of the ancient beacon and the general cabling system of the laundry, turning the small box into a central control console for the entire sector. She pressed down the worn plastic play button. From the surviving wall speakers of the emergency compartment, breaking through the crackle of short circuits, a heavy, dirty Earth bass erupted with a distorted roar. The sound was so dense and aggressive that the surface of the flooded technical floor instantly broke into thick, vibrating ripples. The broken rhythm of the human song crashed down, sinking straight into the dirty water, the support pillars, and the iron bulkheads. This directed low-frequency vibration collided at full speed with the chaotic pulsation of the ancient alien mechanism behind the wall. The entire locked sanitary block transformed in a single second into a giant acoustic resonator, where two completely different forces clashed within the confined space. In the first moments, the station fiercely resisted the foreign physical interference. The counterwaves produced a wild resonant shock that shook crumbs of century-old sealant from the ceiling. The water around Lyra's legs instantly boiled with murky bubbles, scalding her shins through the thick fabric of her jumpsuit. The poor contact in the broken commutator began to loosen from the constant shaking, threatening to cut off the signal transmission forever. Lyra had to grit her teeth and pin the sparking wires to the panel with her burned right hand. Micro-discharges of current struck directly against the dark blisters on her forearm, causing her muscles to cramp with piercing pain. The metal, heating up from the overload, scorched her palm, and the distinct smell of burnt skin filled the air, but the professional wrecker only leaned harder against the wall with her whole body, refusing to break the circuit even for a fraction of a second. The raw human beat proved to be heavier, more rhythmic, and more stubborn than the ancient alien technology. The dirty bass literally pushed through the wandering frequency of the hidden beacon, rigidly imposing its mathematically precise tempo upon it. After 15 seconds of this desperate physical confrontation, the station's powerful life support pumps and massive main valves obediently synced to the broken rhythm of the song. The humming bulkheads began to vibrate strictly in time with the music. The pulsation of the alien device, stripped of its own unpredictable resonance, was completely swallowed by the earthly beat. The crimson thermal indicators behind the wall dimmed, rapidly dumping the critical overheat into the drainage system. The steam pressure in the ruptured pipes dropped sharply, and the orange chemical purge timer above the door froze at the 18-second mark, clicked dully, and went dark forever. Dra'Ken sensed the fundamental change in the environment before the main pipes had even finished cooling. Standing knee-deep in the dirty chemical water, the alien stopped huddling into the far corner of the compartment. His translucent biological tissues reacted instantly to this clear, absolutely predictable rhythm that filled the enclosed space. The amber spore in the fugitive's open chest, which had been convulsively contracting from every chaotic jolt of the beacon, began to pulse smoothly and steadily, strictly in time with the heavy bass line of the player. The toxic purple hue of animal fear finally left Dra'Ken's smooth body, replaced by a deep, calm, and confident glow. The alien organism, incapable of surviving unpredictability, found a reliable physical anchor in this dense human noise. In the corridor on the other side of the locked airlock, external security scanners recorded a sharp drop in critical temperature and a complete normalization of atmospheric pressure. The translucents, who already held their long, pale fingers over the buttons for the manual release of the lethal gas, stepped back from the control consoles in confusion. Their sterile, utterly inflexible computing system of the ring read the updated metrics and officially accepted this deafening acoustic chaos as a valid system protocol for threat decontamination. The smart automation canceled the chemical alert, confirming with a green indicator that the sanitary block no longer posed a danger to the inhabitants of the station. The heavy pressure door of the airlock slowly crawled aside with a long metallic screech, crushing the locking pins that had been damaged by the Cutter 4. Cold artificial light from the hospital lamps of the central corridor flooded into the widening gap. The medical coordinators and the scrappers, who had stepped back a pace, froze on the threshold, silently staring at the scene revealed before them. The emergency compartment was flooded up to the very platforms, with torn utilities and shattered copper pipes sticking out everywhere. In the center of this man-made disaster stood Lyra, the Earthborn girl, soaked to the bone and breathing heavily, her arm covered in blood, and beside her towered Dra'Ken, the absolutely calm alien with his chest open and glowing. And over it all, making the deck and the soles of the onlookers' boots vibrate faintly, an old Earth song continued to roar confidently. Not one of the aliens standing in the corridor uttered a single word of accusation or command. At that moment, the crude human habit of turning on music instead of maintaining silence ceased to be a cause for disdainful mockery, turning into the only working bridge capable of reconciling two incompatible life forms on a single station.